Hey guys! Welcome to Nerdarchy, for nerds, by nerds. I'm Ryan, and today we're going to do an intro into Dungeons & Dragons races. Once again, we'd like to extend a massive thank you to Easy Roller Dice for sponsoring this series. You can check out the description below, where you can find a link to check out their awesome selection of dice, as well as a coupon code that'll save you 20% on your order over on easyrollerdice.com. So in our last video, we went through the process of making our first Dungeons & Dragons character. And once you're more familiar with making a character, you can pretty much take all these steps and start wherever you want to make your character. Because inspiration for role-playing game characters can come from literally anywhere. But in this video, we're going to narrow in and talk about player character races. Now your dwarf, your elf, your human, and your halfling, they're typically considered the standard races for role-playing games. So most medieval fantasy role-playing games are going to have those player character races in some capacity. It's kind of a discussion between you and the dungeon master as far as what niches those creatures fill in the fantasy world. You sort of have your stereotypical way that those races might be perceived in a role-playing game. But maybe as a group or the dungeon master in creating the world decides that that's going to be different in this game setting. Typically, when you have dwarves, they're kind of these stoic and noble and honor-bound creatures. So like dwarves, they tend to be stoic and hardy, and they tend to be made in the mythos of worlds. They kind of have this Celtic origin, so sometimes they're maybe flavored a little bit like Scottish, being clannish and things like that. But you could decide that maybe you want to model your dwarves differently, and in your game world, maybe they're based off of a Japanese culture, for instance. Like you could have something with samurais, and it'd be a very different set of dwarves than you would, and customs than you have in a typical game setting world. Now elves are typically considered aloof and sort of almost chaotic, and then they have this bond between magic, nature, and beauty is sort of the typical standard elves. Again, sometimes they're also oriented towards having a Celtic mythos, but sometimes they've also just stereotypically in some worlds been tied to like an Asian culture. But you know, in your game setting, and maybe they're renowned horsemen in the game world that you have, for instance, would be a different way to do elves. Halflings tend to have an eat, drink, and be merry. But let's forget about the possibly dying bit, because they're more of a comfort-drawn race. Yeah, like the Lord of the Rings stereotypical halfling, the Happy Hobbit thing. That tends to be a pretty adequate depiction of what the stereotypical halflings tend to be. In some game worlds, they take on this role of being like a gypsy-esque sort of culture. So halflings are known to just sort of live on the edges of other cultures and societies as well. And then you have humans. Any human culture that has existed on Earth, you could use that in your game world and model culture after that. Or you could create something new. Maybe you blend different cultures together, and taking 2 or 3 elements from this culture and 2 or 3 elements from this culture, and you sort of mash them together. You create something new and unique that's never existed before. And then you get into your weirder races, your dragonborn, your half-orc, your half-elf, your tiefling. So kind of the way that the player's handbook describes this is that these are races that may not exist in every game world. Like in some game worlds, maybe the offspring of the different demi-humans, like half-orcs and half-elves, like maybe they can't exist in your world because those different races just can't crossbreed with other races. Or you have your way of how you're going to describe those existing in your world. Like tieflings could be from the pact with demons, or they could be a race that was cursed to look demon-esque. It all depends on what you and your group decide that you want to have at your game table. You could have a world where dragonborn are common, or they're like monstrosities that no one has ever seen before and everyone's freaked out when they do encounter them. Or as a group, you could decide that they just don't exist at all, really. Oh, I guess I forgot to mention the noble gnome. So for some reason, the gnome used to be a standard part of the game, and then they got shunted into being the a part of the uncommon races. It's weird, but it happened. But I tend to think of gnomes as being a part of the standard D&D in my book. So the Dragonborn are kind of noted to be noble and honor-bound themselves. Gnomes have that sort of natural inquisitiveness about them, and also a similar love of nature that are noted with elves. Basically, gnomes are kind of some midway point between the inventiveness of dwarves and the natural beauty appreciation of elves. They're kind of the halfway between those two. There's half elves, which they're that sort of, they could either have a midway range of views between humans and elves, or they could have been raised in one society or the other without completely fitting in, so they could be a bit of an outcast character. Or they can just exist in any civilized society or not so civilized. If you wanted to have like a barbarian tribe that happened to have sacked a caravan or something and they're raising a half-elf, well, that could be an explanation how your half-elf barbarian came to be, perhaps. So the half-orc, they tend to hold on to that ferocity of their orcish parentage, and they tend to live in very much the margins of civil societies themselves as well. Maybe kind of distrusted, depending on how your world's going to view things, and maybe how front and center you want to have, say, things like racism present in your game world. So lastly, that brings us to tieflings, which, I mean, you know, they tend to have cloven horns or maybe vestige wings or horns or anything like that, or maybe they have like red or blue skin or anything. So they're clearly marked by their fiendish or abyssal parentage. And so I think the most extreme reactions are probably going to be towards the tiefling and the dragonborn. And so, again, it's at your gaming table, do you want to hand wave what's going on here, or do you really want to play about the suspicion that a demonic-looking character might bring about them? So all these discussions are just baseline assumptions that the player's handbook and sort of past gaming experience has brought us to today. But for your gaming table and your gaming group, you may decide that the history of the different races and how they interact is just different, and that's fine too. So you can either work within the framework of a pre-existing world, or start to build a world together as a gaming group, or the dungeon master could very overarchingly say, well, this is how I want things to be in the world, and if you're cool with accepting it like that, then accepting it how it is, then you guys can just go forward and play with that. So again, all these are just baseline assumptions of how player races interact in the world. As you get further into the hobby, you may want to play with sort of the stereotypes and how does your character break from the mold of these societies, or maybe reinvent game world races and societies in your game. And it's also a worthwhile discussion with the dungeon master of how they want the races to interact in the world, how just the society at large views certain races, how much you want to bring in real world struggles and turmoil into your game world. Do you want to just make this a fun fantasy game and not really worry about sort of social political problems and difficulties, or do you want to have racism front and center and the struggles that's going to create for your character? So that's all sort of up to you and your gaming group, and how much you want to deal with the real world struggles, or do you just want to make this game purely about escapism? That's all on you and what your group of friends enjoys. After you've been playing Dungeons and Dragons for a while, you may find that certain races just sort of speak to you, that it's just a race you tend to like to play. Like for me, that's halflings. For Dave, that's dwarves. And then Nate and Ted, they tend to like to play elves or half-elves in this edition of the game. So you might find that there's just a race, for whatever reason, again and again, you go back to want to play. Some races do excel at being certain character classes, but if you just have an idea that grabs you and it just seems awesome and fun to play, you should just play it. Go with the cool, fun character concept rather than the most optimal thing, because you're just going to have a better time, really. Basically, the idea for a character can come from anywhere. If the character race isn't the thing that sparks your imagination, maybe look through the character classes and something jumps there, and then you figure out the race later. You can build these characters any way you want. There's no, other than following the rules of what a character can do, there's no right or wrong way to make a character. So in our next video, we are going to talk about an overview about the character classes. Don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, put your questions below. Thanks again to Easy Roller Dice for supporting this video series, and until next time, stay nerdy. Typically, when you have dwarves, they're kind of these stoic and noble and honor-bound creatures. So like dwarves, they tend to be stoic and hardy, and they tend to be made in the mythos of worlds. They kind of have this Celtic origin, so sometimes they're maybe flavored a little bit like Scottish, being clannish and things. We have a discussion between you and the dungeon master as far as what niches those creatures fill in the fantasy world. You sort of have your stereotypical way that those races might be perceived in a role-playing game, but maybe as a group or the dungeon master in creating their world decides that that's going to be different in this game setting. Hey guys! Welcome to Nerdarchy, for nerds by nerds. I'm Ryan, and today we're going to do an intro into Dungeons & Dragons races. Once again, we'd like to extend a massive thank you to Easy Roller Dice for sponsoring this series. You can check out the description below, where you can find a link to check out their awesome selection of dice, as well as a coupon code that'll save you 20% on your order over on easyrollerdice.com. So in our last video, we went through the process of making our first Dungeons & Dragons character. And once you're more familiar with making a character, you can pretty much take all these steps and start wherever you want to make your character, because inspiration for role-playing game characters can come from literally anywhere. But in this video, we're going to narrow in and talk about player character races. Now your dwarf, your elf, your human, and your halfling, they're typically considered the standard races for role-playing games, so most medieval fantasy role-playing games are going to have those player character races in some capacity. It's kind